Hey students, we're going to be wrapping up Chapter 30 talking about the Americans fighting in the war, how the Allies defeated the Central Powers, and the aftermath of the war. American troops would not reach the European conflict until a full year after the declaration of war. Wilson would send troops all across Europe. Wilson was not only attempting to stop the Central Powers, but also Allied powers from establishing imperialist strongholds. The bulk of American troops would be placed in France, where the army would face a furious fight against the Germans and their new weapons. The Germans had made advancements that the world was not prepared to fight: automatic machine guns, chemical warfare, submarines, and flamethrowers. These were weapons that man had never had experience fighting against, and they took their toll. 30,000 Americans would be thrown to the German wolves in Chateau Thierry, France. French and American troops would hold a 25-mile front to launch a surprise assault early on the morning of July 18, 1918. The German forces would be overwhelmed by the over-the-top assault, pushing the Germans back to the river Marine. There, the Americans and French would meet other Allied troops. Americans and other Allied powers would engage in the second Battle of the Marine, pushing the Germans back. This would begin the German withdrawal. The Germans would seek peace after the Allies would launch an assault with over 1.2 million men with the Meuse-Argonne offense. The objective was to destroy the German railroad supply line to the Western front in hopes to starve out the German troops. The Allied forces would win this offense, and the Germans were ready to surrender. The Germans would surrender on the 11th hour, on the 11th minute, on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. Finally, the war to end wars was over. The war would take its toll on humanity. Nearly 9 million soldiers would die in battle, with over 20 million more suffering from horrific injuries. The United States had given money, food, arms, and the blood of her sons to stop the Central Powers and free Europe. Wilson was hailed as a hero of the Western world. He would continue his campaign for democracy and peace with his 14 points. Wilson would negotiate with territory-hungry nations such as Britain and France with the proposed League of Nations to decide such measures. The League of Nations was Wilson's crown jewel in his 14 points. It was meant to ensure future peace for the world and prevent another devastating war. The European powers were willing to join a League convention, but Wilson's fight was not in Europe. It would be a Republican Senate. Republicans in the Senate outright refused a treaty to join the League of Nations, stating that they did not want to surrender the United States' sovereignty at the risk of another European conflict. This would cause a severe headache for Wilson because he also was dealing with the Europeans fighting over conquered lands. The League of Nations treaty would not be the only treaty that would be met with scorn. After mere weeks of deliberation, the Treaty of Versailles was handed to the Germans in June 1919. This treaty was met with outcries from the Germans. They were left out of the treaty deliberations, but had faith that Wilson would help them not to be abused. The treaty made the Germans surrender most of the territories to the League of Nations, dismantled their military to only 100,000, charged the Germans the bill for the war from the Allies, and to have the River Rhine occupied for 15 years. Once again, Wilson would be lambasted at home for an unpopular treaty. Anti-German Americans would state that the treaty was not harsh enough, and German Americans would say that the treaty was abuse. Irish Americans would fumigate at the thought that the United States and Britain would be allies with the League of Nations. Wilson would stand his ground and state that he would be willing to die for this cause, much like the soldiers in the war. In September 1919, Wilson would start a presidential tour that was not met with a warm beginning. The Midwest was mostly German-American and gave Wilson a lukewarm welcome at best. Wilson would receive a hero's welcome at the Rocky Mountain and Pacific regions, but this would be the highlight of the tour. Wilson's stress would catch up to him. He collapsed from exhaustion on September 25th, 1919, and later in the tour, when he was in Washington, D.C., he would suffer a stroke that would paralyze half his body, and this would last through the rest of his presidency to 1921. Meanwhile, Congress was deadlocked on the League of Nations. The treaty was being held up by isolationist Republican senators. Wilson would not budge on any terms given to him. He would start to rely on the American people, stating that the people would decide with the election of 1920 with a solemn referendum. This would make the election difficult for Democrats, as Wilson had just made the election about the League of Nations. Democrats would nominate Governor James Cox, and the Republicans would nominate Senator Warren Harding. Harding would launch a campaign that would give out contradictory messages about the League of Nations, but would instead support a association of nations. The nail in the coffin for the League came with the election of Warren G. Harding. The United States would not join the League of Nations. Historians today argue that the United States exits from the international stage would set for the rise of Nazi Germany with Adolf Hitler. Alright, students, that's it for Chapter 30. We'll talk more when we come back together. Please make sure that you're reading your books, wash your hands, and do not touch your face and stay inside.